Chapter 7, from 1803 to 1824, Section 5. William Sorel, Esquire, 3rd Lieutenant Governor, landed 8th April, 1817. To restore safety to the colony was the first duty of the governor. On his assumption of office, he called the inhabitants together and, enabled by their subscriptions, he offered large rewards and thus inspirited both the soldiers and the constables. In less than 3 months, the greater portion of the bushrangers were destroyed or captured. During Sorel's administration, the colony suffered no serious disturbance from outlaws. This display of rigor was followed by judicious precautions. He ascertained more frequently the distribution and employment of the prisoners of the Crown and removed many temptations to disorder and crime. It was the practice, established first a few months after his arrival, to muster the whole population annually. Notice was sent through the districts, requiring the attendance of the several classes who accounted for their families and their stock. The name, the residence, and civil condition of every inhabitant became known. Sorel thus ascertained the increase of cultivation and cattle, and whatever indicated progress. The landing of settlers direct from Great Britain was an important event. Their efforts were experiments, and their achievements were prophetic. The political philosopher may trace in their errors, trials, and successes the lessons afforded by experience for the instruction of nations. The rapid advance of modern colonization tends to underrate the first efforts of our predecessors. The first colonial boat builder founded a great commercial navy. The first shepherd held in his slender flock a treasure of unimaginable worth. The arrival of many emigrants led to the exploration of the country. The hunters were usually the pioneers, but beyond the general features of the scenery, they afforded little information. Wild cattle were the better guides. To provide a settlement for strangers, Sorel explored the region lying between the Shannon and the Clyde to its junction with the Derwent, free from timber and within 20 miles of navigable waters. At this district were located several distinguished settlers. The narrow grants and wretched homesteads of the emancipist cotters, the sole farmers at the time of this immigration, presented but little to please. The settler, whose imagination pictured the rustic beauties and quiet order of an English farm, saw unfenced fields of grain deformed with blackened stumps, a low cottage of the meanest structure surrounded by heaps of wool, bones, and sheepskins, harrows and water carts amidst firewood, mutton and kangaroo strung on the branches of trees. Idle and uncleanly men of different civil condition but of one class. Tribes of dogs and natives, no green hedges or flowery meadows or notes of the thrush or nightingale. But yet there was the park-like lands, the brilliant skies, the pure river, and above all the untainted breath of the morning. In 1820 there were only 2 estates, those of Mr. E. Lord and Colonel Davy, on which fences were erected, and the destructive incursions of cattle were subjects of many complaints. Yet in that year £20,000 had been obtained for wheat exported to Sydney. The first crops were prolific. The early settlers chose the more fertile and open plains, and many selected sites for their dwellings on natural lawns of surpassing beauty. The dispatch of vessels direct from England rapidly increased the population. In 1 year, being 1822, 600 settlers entered the port, and by the capital which they invested, and the habits of decency and enterprise they exhibited, gave a new tone to the colony. A succession of publications drew attention at home to the capabilities of Van Diemen's Land. It was described in the Quarterly Review of May 1820 by a friendly pen, which stated that during 3 years a detachment of 100 men had not lost 3, and that Hobart Town had been 16 months without a funeral. The work of Lieutenant Jeffreys, who spent several months in a passage from Sydney to Van Diemen's Land, and who wrote much in praise of the native women and the pleasures of a bush life, drew a pleasing picture. The more sober sketch of Captain Dixon and the copious delineations of Mr. Wentworth directed the public curiosity to Tasmania. For several successive years, new books were published, describing the fertility of the soil and the beauty of the climate. These generally contained a theory of pastoral increase, a geometrical progression towards wealth. The increase was, indeed, rapid beyond Oriental precedent. Between 1810 and 1820, it was estimated at 50-fold. The adaptation of these colonies for the growth of wool first drew the attention of several gentlemen of Hamburg, whose importations afterwards promoted the improvement of our flocks. The position of Van Diemen's Land favoured its settlement. Vessels bound to Port Jackson often touched at the Derwent to discharge portions of their cargo, and weary with the length of the voyage, emigrants listened to the persuasions of the colonists and the hints of the lieutenant governor himself. The advantages offered to settlers so late as 1808 included not only grants of land, but loans of stock and seed, and a price for wheat long standing at 10 shillings per bushel, and for meat 6pence per pound. The settlers were entitled to rations for themselves and their convict servants for 6 months. It was stipulated that the stock should be replaced by the increase, and the wheat repaid at the harvest. Such engagements were, however, rarely fulfilled. No suits could be prosecuted by the Crown in the local court, and vague threats of disfavour were the only means of recovery. These were understood as formalities. The Crown, by the prohibition of distillation, prevented a consumption of grain, and until a fixed price was given, corn had been sometimes of no value whatever. A partial market was assured to prevent the total neglect of agriculture. The patronage, of course, led to official corruption. Many officers received wheat from their servants in commutation of labour, and some of more than usual inferiority was thus admitted by a Launceston commandant, a refugee Frenchman who threatened to transport the storekeeper for calling in question its quality. The Commissioner Biggie recommended the bounty should be entirely abolished, distillation permitted, and supplies purchased by tender. A deficiency could be no longer apprehended. There were 7,400 inhabitants at the close of 1821 who possessed 15,000 cultivated acres, 35,000 horned cattle, 170,000 sheep, 550 horses, and 5,000 swine. With such resources, the danger of famine finally disappeared. The herds were composed chiefly of Bengal cattle, imported at an early period, but the emigrants introduced the most valued of the English breeds, which have entirely supplanted the early stock. The herbage and the climate are equally favourable to the increase of cattle. The interior of the country being quiet, tickets of occupation were granted to settlers, who were enabled to establish large herds and flocks on the lands of the Crown. The scarcity of provision in New South Wales soon created a considerable demand for the produce of this country, and in 1820, meat to the value of £10,000 was purchased by the Crown for exportation. Macquarie, when his administration was drawing to a close, came on a tour of inspection to Van Diemen's Land. He arrived in the Midas. The squally weather, which prevented his immediate landing, gave time to prepare for his reception. He disembarked on the 24th of April, 1821, saluted from the battery and by the military, who lined the road to the Government House. At his former visit in 1810, the population did not exceed 1,500. A few scattered and miserable huts, separated by thoroughfares but half recovered from the forests, then constituted the capital, which had now acquired something of an English aspect. There were 426 houses and 2,700 souls. Few scenes are more pleasing than those which, assisted by memory, display the growth and triumph of industry. The gratification of all parties was visible, and a general illumination closed the day. It was a day of pardons and bounty, when the prisoner received his liberty and the settler his heritage. Every inhabitant who had no plaint to prefer had yet thanks to pay. The bachelors of Hobart Town gave a public ball to the governor, 150 sat down to supper, and the gentlemen danced together until the morning. On the 29th of June, Macquarie sailed in the Caroline. He was accompanied to the water's edge by a large concourse of people, and carried with him applauses which his amiable vanity prized, and which his beneficence deserved. Macquarie inserted in the Sydney Gazette the details of his progress and observations. Whatever he described, he lauded. The architectural taste of the private buildings, the handsome church, the commodious military barracks, the strong jail, the well-constructed hospital, the enterprise and industry of the people, their spacious harbour, their battery, signal post, and pier are all distinguished with the minuteness of an auctioneer's catalogue, and nearly in its phrases. During his progress, he gave names, among which many remain memorials of his love of country, including Staffa Ulra and Olmaig, Perth, Campbelltown, Oatlands, Strathallan Creek and Roseneath. The townships of Sorel, Brighton and Elizabeth were designated by him, the last in honour of his wife. His own name is found everywhere. End of Chapter 7 being Chapter 2 from 1803 to 1824, Section 5.